In this lesson, we're going to learn how we can speed up the quality of our 3D motion blur from the scanline render node by using a vector blur along with our increased samples. So I've just opened up this scene here, 11_begin, and let's just take a look at our scanline render. So in our first viewer here, I'm just going to look at the scanline render and unpause it. So right now with one sample, we're not going to get any motion blur. But there's a lot of movement in this camera. If we hit back and forward, we can see there's a lot of motion. So we need some kind of motion blur. Now we can of course increase this or create motion blur by increasing the sample. So you can see with samples of 3, we can begin to see some motion blur, but it's going to be very jagged and stair-steppy. And we're going to just have to keep increasing the number of samples until we get something that we like. And as you can see, as we increase the number of samples, it slows down our render considerably. Now over here on viewer 3, I've actually paused the viewer on a render I took with 30 samples. And as you can imagine, it took a little while to preview. Now we can see that this motion blur looks really nice. It's nice and smooth, accurate, and no jagged edges. However, to get that, we had to increase our samples by quite a lot and slow down our render time. So let's take a look at how another way we can do this by actually combining the samples with a vector blur. So to do this, I'm going to jump back to my first viewer here, and let's decrease our samples to something like 3. And to use the vector blur node, we need some motion vector information. Now the scanline render can actually output this very cheaply or inexpensively. And we can do that by going to the shader and turning on output vectors. Once we do that, we can see these 3 vector channels appear in our scanline render. So now if we take a look at this and we look at our forward vectors, it looks like nothing's there, but if we actually look at the pixel information, as you can see down here, the pixel data or the vector data is there. So what we can do now is we can add in that vector blur. So I'm just hit tab and typed in vector blur. And let's take a look at this. And of course for our vector blur, we're going to need to turn on, let me jump back to my viewer 1 here. We're going to need to turn on our actual vector blur by going to UV channels and setting those to forward. And again, that just matches whatever we're outputting out of our scanline render node. And now we can see that our vector blur or our blur is nice and smooth, as well as renders very quickly. Now we get a little bit of blur artifacting in some areas where we might not want it, but we can always come in here and change these values of our vector blur to really control how much blur we are getting, as well as change our method to forward to give us slightly more accurate results. Now if you're getting a little bit too blurry, we can actually change the motion vector type we're outputting from classic to accurate, and that will heavily increase the quality of our motion blur. You'll notice before we were getting a lot of motion blur on this rock, and now we're not getting any, but we're still getting that nice motion blur on these other areas. So remember that we can always come into our scanline render node and output motion vectors so that we can create these motion blurs much less expensively and much faster here inside of Nuke.